Hello and welcome to our final day of International Leadership Week 2021 and our penultimate session today. I'd like to extend our thanks to our sponsors, Belbin and Heriot-Watt University, Edinburgh Business School, for their support this week. It's been tremendous. I'm Gaynor Lewis, Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I'm delighted to be joined by Marco Buschman for this session, Leading in a Complicated and/or Complex World. More very soon. Just before we begin, for those who are not familiar with the Institute, we're a professional body focusing on achieving our core mission, which is inspiring great leadership everywhere. And we do that throughout our engaged community of over 55,000 leaders and managers across every stage of their career, across all industry sectors, and in more than 70 countries. So let's turn our attention to the Netherlands. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome back, actually, Marco, an accredited master team and executive coach, internationally recognized leadership expert, facilitator, and inspirational speaker, as well as best-selling author. So we're really looking forward to this session. Marco will be drawing on his experience, therefore, to outline for us how can we lead in this complicated and complex, complicated or complex environment. So it's very timely for the world that we all find ourselves in. Please do post your questions during the session in the chat box, which is on the right-hand panel of your screen, and we'll address as many of these as possible at the end of the session. And also engage on social media using the hashtag ILW21. So without further ado, over to you, Marco. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gaynor, for the warm introduction. And I'm happy to be back in the International Leadership Week. And I so much enjoy that also your institute is actually creating this week to share knowledge from all over the globe and to just share it with the people who are currently online, but also afterwards, of course, who will review it afterwards. So I would say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you are. And I'm going to talk with you and share some concepts on how to lead in a complicated and or complex world. It's 20 minutes, and what I will actually share three models or frameworks that are important to take into consideration, and also will show you how those three actually are related to each other. Just building on a short introduction by Gaynor already. Here's my introduction, which I would also add. I'm Marco Buschman, indeed out of the Netherlands. And from a human doing perspective, that is the functional side, that is what I do in life. Indeed, already spoken, I'm an executive master coach, a team coach. I'm a managing partner. I love to write books. I love to inspire. The Connection Quotient is also the latest book released international. And here are some of my clients. But when we start talking about how to lead in this complicated and complex world, I would say also let me introduce myself from the human being point. Because next to being a proud father of 3 kids, being married, and also being a lover of music, festivals, and love to dance and so on, I also take into consideration what can I do in order to stay energized. And if you want to lead in a complicated or complex world, it starts by make sure that you have the energy to lead. Now, what is that I do actually to do that is in the morning when I wake up and I have my showers, I always finish with a cold shower. It's not say that I really fancy it. And each morning I go like, really, am I going to do it? And I say yes. And I say yes for 2 reasons. One reason is there's Wim Hof, the Iceman, who actually says 1 cold shower a day keeps the doctor away. And I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but what I notice since I am taking cold showers in the morning, it really has a positive impact on also my physicality. And I haven't had that much colds anymore. The second thing I tell myself basically also with the cold shower, this is my first commitment for the day. So directly after the shower, I already have my first commitment. Now, furthermore, also, I do my meditations each morning. I love to play golf, but monthly, I also take a massage or go to the physiotherapist just to do a checkup. I do my sleep for like 7.5 hours a night, and also minimal work in the evenings and in the weekends. So that's what I do in order to stay energized. And I hope you have also found your own rituals, because in this world where there's complexity and which is also complicated, we need to have energy to stay focused and give our full attention to the questions that is actually coming to us. So in case you don't have your ritual yet, I would say that would my first probe to you. Think about, what is that you could actually do. Now, that is something that you can actually do, but I also would like to give you, like I said, 3 concepts on what is actually also more from the human doing perspective, something that we can do while working with our teams, our organizations, our customers, to reduce complexity or reduce the complicated situation. Now, the first model that I would like to introduce here is the Cynefin framework. It's a Welsh word, which actually stands for habitat, if I understand well. And it was prompted in the 90s, and it was in 2007 released also in the HBR magazine. It is by Dave Snowden. And what he actually brings to the table is, if you look at the world, you could say there is the predictable world and the ordered world, and there's also the unpredictable world and the unordered world. And what he also debates here is, depending on where you are in the quadrant, you also have to adapt your decision-making style. So let me just take you through the model and the different elements. The first one is what he calls the obvious. In the past, he used to call it the simple, but simple is too simple, but it's obvious nowadays. He calls it obvious, and that's the domain of the best practice. So, for instance, that's also the domain where you can say, I can predict what will happen, and we can actually create patterns for it. We can create standardized procedures and have checklists, and everyone agrees about what needs to be done. So, for instance, if you have an issue with your IT, you just call your help desk. And if you call your help desk or your IT desk, they will listen to your question. They will assess what's happening. Then they will categorize your question. And from the category, they also will respond to you with, so this is then the answer. This is what needs to be done. It's a simple, straightforward, everyone understands, agrees. And it's so the IT help desk really works. Yet there's, of course, with each step, there's always a risk involved as well. Although in the obvious world, you sense, you assess, you categorize, and you respond, the risk is that you start oversimplifying, that you say like everything needs to be put into the system. So for each action, we will actually find a category and a response, which actually is not true. You can also turn into complacence. That you actually say like, but that's how I've always done it, and therefore it will always work. Whereas, as you know, IT the IT world changes. So sometimes we also need to adapt our response. And therefore, rigid systems might fall to chaos ultimately if you don't adapt them. If you just say, it's once designed, and now we keep it for the rest of our lives this way. Now, if you then go to the next level, then you get to the complicated world. And this is where the cause and effect, well, we can actually, in a way, predict it, but it's not entirely straightforward. So that also means that in this domain of expertise, this is also where if we have a complicated question, we just ask our experts to give some of the background, some information, and to give their views on it. And that also means that they will assess, and then when they assess, they start analyzing, and when they finalize analyze it, they come up with the answer and the action to take it forward. So back to the IT help desk, the first line, you raise the question, they couldn't find the answer in the system, it goes to the second line. In the second line, that's also where the experts, and they will take a deeper dive into what is the question, what is the issue, what might be the solution. This is where they debate. And that also means that at some point, they will come to a conclusion. So there might be a little bit of like some differences in the conclusions, but in a way they all point in the same direction. Or for instance, when you want to put a man on the moon, that is not a complex framework, that's not a complex question. Bringing a man to the moon is also a complicated question. You can all assess and analyze what needs to happen, and therefore in a way predict how to launch the rockets and get the man on the moon and back to Earth again. Now this is still predictable, but then at some point you go over to the unpredictable world. And this is also where you start coming from the complex worlds. So the main difference between complicated and complex is predictable or unpredictable. So for instance, if you look currently also with what's happening with COVID, now there's so many factors that actually contribute, and there is no one best solution. By the way, it's also a situation we're currently in that we actually never experienced before. So there are no solutions. And we need to keep adapting also, not only how to work with the virus, but also the response of people. There's so many people within society who respond differently. So what is the best? We don't know. So what you need to do here in a complex situation, rather than ask experts, we also need to come from more sophisticated and flexible thinking. We need to have patience. And ultimately what we need to do, rather than say this is the answer and this is what we need to do, we need to more come from hypotheses and conduct experiments. And that also means, like, if we do an experiment and we probe it, then we start sensing what is the impact, does it work, what doesn't work, and so on. And hopefully we relearn from it, and therefore we can more in the future respond with more clarity. Now here it's also truly important with complex questions in societies is that you don't go back to, but let's create a project plan from start to end. That is not going to work. You have to stay safe, of course, and play safe, that is true, but don't over-try it, because then you actually start working with a complex situation from a complicated response. That also means that don't lose your nerves. The answer will not directly show up. It will emerge by having more experiments. More and more the answer or the direction will actually show it and reveal it themselves. So again, the risk is that since we don't have the nerves, or it's taking us too long, that we start seeing it as a complicated question. We ask some experts, we have a good project plan, and then we're going to execute. That's not what we need to do in a complex world. Now, finally, if we move over from complex to chaotic, that is much more like something is happening right now in this moment, and you have to respond to it directly. Of course, for instance, if there's an earthquake, that is typically a chaotic. In the first moment, you have to act on it. Or, for instance, cyber security. If you don't have cyber crime, and you don't have any plans for it, you did not even think about it. Although that's a bit odd, I think, in these days. But if you haven't thought about it, and suddenly, there's ransom, the ransom software is hitting your systems, then you will end up in a chaotic situation. And that just basically means you have to act. You have to act in order to stabilize. And when you act, that is well, so afterwards you start sensing, now, what is the impact of my action? Is it actually stabilizing the situation? And the more it stabilizes, we can actually say that's good. But where it doesn't stabilize, we have to respond. So in a chaotic, that is also the domain of rapid response, you have to step up. That probably also means most of the time you have to be direct and top-down management at first instance. Now, the risk here is also that at some point you feel like this is working, this is the best way, and therefore we're going to make a procedure of it. This will be our standard. Don't. That is only for the chaotic. And sometimes also people want to be legendary, and therefore, this is also the moment for them to shine. Now, what you basically want is also, if you have, for instance, a complex question, the more you do it, the more you also experiment, you sense and you respond and you learn from it. At some point, you hope that the complex situation becomes a complicated question, or the chaotic becomes a complex question, or the complicated becomes an obvious question. So the more you do it, it will actually also bring you from the unpredictable world back to the predictable world. Now, finally, there's also what they call disorder. And the essence of disorder is actually you don't have a clue what kind of problem, what kind of question you're trying to answer. Is it an obvious, complicated, complex, or chaotic question? Now, if I were to summarize, why would you use the Cynefin framework? First of all, to really make sure that there is flexibility in the decision-making approach. Because you and I, we are humans, so we work from patterns. And therefore, sometimes we have the tendency to say, whatever the answer, the hammer is the response. So because we use it for nails, so we now start using it for screws as well. And that's the same what we do as humans. We tend to go for patterns. And the Cynefin shows really like we need to be flexible in our decision-making approach. Or as Snowden and the co-author in the article debate, the Cynefin framework can help use executives to sense which context they are in. And therefore, you can not only make better decisions, but also avoid the problems that arise when your preferred management style makes mistakes. And finally, I would also debate here that, in this world, there's no I'm the leader, so I know it all and I tell you what to do. We need to be willing to share our power. In complex and complicated environments, I would say we need to use and utilize the power of the team, the power of diversity of thought, and so on. And the Cynefin framework actually, again, helps you see the truth of it. Now, we know, though, there are different ways of actually questions and situations we're trying to address. Now, let's also zoom in. Let's say it's a complicated or it's a complex question. Now, if we also want to bring across the other people and we want to have the team and use the power of the team, we should also be able to frame the question or the situation in such a way that it's easy to understand and compelling. And in order to do so, I would love to introduce also the SCQA or the SCQH framework. And this is adapted from Barbara Minto, and you can read more about it in the pyramid principle. What she debates, if you want to create a storyline to pass on, like really what is that we're talking about, you should start with making clear about what is the situation. In the situation, this is also where you would share something with your audience that they are familiar with, that they know. So typically, these kind of sentences would start with, as you know, because if I use the as you know, I already tell you there's something coming up. Did you know yourself as well, and you are ready to listen for it. Now, that's also really important that in the situation, you don't share any new ideas or concepts, or don't come up with any questions or any complications yet. You just start with the S of the situation. But then you get to the C, the complication, that provides a twist. Well, you've seen enough movies, and in movies as well, you have a foundation, a start, but then at some point there's a twist that makes the plot also more interesting. And that's the same when you start defining your issues and opportunities. After you share the situation, let's create a twist because it is actually helpful for the mind. It is also a reason for us to care why we should listen not only to what's a nice situation, but why we should pay attention about what's coming up next. So it actually is also the trigger to the question. So typically, this would actually start with however. So the situation, as you know, and then however, So the complication is there, the twist is there, that actually leads us to the third, and that is the question. So what is the question? And again, and this is really important, I've seen many people who are already addressing answers here. Don't. We're just building a storyline. So what is the situation, complication, and now what is the question that we're trying to address? And try to frame it in a simple way. And once you have the S, the C, and the Q, then we get to the A or the H, and that depends on whether it's a complicated or a complex situation. If it's a complicated situation, then we get to the SCQA, the answer, an action plan. So this is also where we say, this is a situation, this is the complication, this is the question, and therefore it leads to this answer. Whereas if it's a complex situation that we're trying to answer, so then we need to probe, we need to come with experiments, but before that we need to come up with some hypotheses, because a hypothesis will also lead to an experiment that we could actually define. Now, I know this is a lot of theory. Let me show you also how that works in practice, in reality, by giving you a short example. And here it is. So, for instance, we could actually say the situation, as you know, we are living in a complex world with lots of uncertainty. Also, the World Economic Forum states we're in the fourth industrial revolution, a world in which change is the new normal and in which adaptation is key. In this era, organizations that are continuously able to transform and or reinvent themselves will stay current and will survive. So hopefully you recognize this situation. Now let's create a twist. However, and here's the complication, however, organizations can't transform themselves. It's the people that can transform, and therefore the organization will transform. Yet, people transformation is a complex activity. There are many, even opposing theories and insights on what is the best approach to influence the way people think and act. And each day, new experience and research becomes available on this topic as well. So you see, we have the situation, but there's a twist. How to actually influence those people. So now we need to get to the next phase. That's the question. So therefore, the question is, as a first step, how do we create awareness that our people need to start thinking and acting from an adaptive and transformational mindset? And of course, this is the question I have chosen. And you could have decided to choose a different question as well. And finally, the question will also lead to a hypothesis. So if we use storytelling techniques to create and send out a message that is comprehensive, interesting, and has a pleasant narrative arc, our employees will feel the urgency for an adaptive and transformational mindset and will actively ask to be trained in this area. So you see, this will lead to something that I believe that might be true. So basically what I say is, using the SCQH, create a story that people can relate to. Also, it leads to a better result. And finally, I would say, you bring the complexity back in a message to something that is really simple. Now, finally, and that's my final statement that I would like to leave you with, then the question is, how do we also create creative answers, and how do we test it? And also the answer that we just thought about, is that like the ultimate answer? And therefore I would introduce the 6 thinking hats by Edward de Bono. And what he basically says, we all as people, we have a preferred style of thinking, whereas it would be beneficial if you would actually also look at the same issue or problem from different perspectives. And what he says, you as a team, what if you would be wearing 6 different hats? And the red hat actually would come from the gut and the intuition. So when I talk about storytelling, I would say, yes, that would certainly work. And, this is also, you don't need to justify. And I would just say, I've done this training on improvisation theater. I've seen the impact. So yes, it works. And others might actually also say why they feel like this is good or not such a good idea. But then as a team, we would actually start wearing the white hat, the factual hat. And this is also where we would say, ask for information. So this is also where I would say, but is there actually scientific research? It also shows us that if we use storytelling, it actually also raises more awareness. Or is there also scientific research or experience that actually shows like what's the best way to do it in our kind of organization? Now, again, as a team, we get all sort of questions and information from the white hat. We point it down, we write it down, and then we start to go over to the next hat, the yellow hat. That's the optimist hat. What are the benefits and value? And I would say here, the yellow hat would actually also say, the benefits actually also, it will create a positive energy and an atmosphere and culture within the organization, and so on. And others might also see benefits and values. And then we all move over to the 4th hat, the black hat. And this is also where we can say, but there's also caution. And in the black hat, I might debate, but all people are different. So using a entertaining story, might work for some people who are quite optimistic and positive, but other people who are much more introverted and need more data, they might not be okay with a storyline like this. And others might also bring in some black hat thoughts and discussions and identify risks. But then we go over to the green hat altogether. And in the green hat, there's the creative hat. And this is also where we might come up with some alternative ideas. And then finally, you move over to the blue hat. And in the blue hat, you say, listening to all of those elements. Now, what is actually what we need to learn from here? What is emerging, looking at the same issue or the solution from all those different perspectives? Now, I would debate always start with the red and end with the blue, but for the rest, the order is different. You can always choose. Some people might even say start with the blue to create a process and then just start wearing all the others. But why use these 6 thinking hats in the complicated and complex situations? Because it will expand your own thinking style. It will create and increase the creativity. It will bring more focus and it will create openness in the team.
Superb.
Yeah, so that's the summary. I would say use the Gneffin, define SCQA to define it, and use the 6 hats to produce creative thinking and boost your productivity.
Wow.
That's what I would love to say here.
Thank you so much, Marco. And somebody has literally put in the chat just that. Thank you for putting all of this into context. And I can only agree, and for giving clarity to some of those distinctions and also providing us with a framework to help us, really work through those issues ourselves. So really, really appreciate that. Thank you, Marco. There are a number of questions coming through, and maybe one of the first ones, this is an interesting one. So how do leaders best reflect and learn in a complex or the chaotic domains? So when you're in those sort of spaces where it's less, if you like, predictable, how can leaders learn and reflect?
Well, I would first say breathe. And I would say breathe with a smile, because why sometimes we're so occupied in trying to fix and therefore we start running that we don't take the time to reflect on the actions and the impact, but also to introspect on where does it come from and what does it say about our own needs and behaviors. So we need to create space to also work with others. And I would say don't do it all by yourself, because then you will have your own biases. But if you work with a group of peers or work with a business coach or work with a mentor internally or externally, to really go through the situation on a slower pace and to understand, so what are the assumptions underneath that I had? Or what are some of the thoughts that I took into account, and what are some of the biases? This is where we can start learning and start seeing about what's emerging here. But it's really about, are you willing to create space for it? And that's the most important.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Another question is how you might approach a crisis where time is much more of the essence. So how could we apply this thinking, if you like, or maybe the 6 thinking hats, when time is much more critical?
Well, I would say if time is critical, I'm not sure if it's then a predictable, complicated or complex question. Well, if there's a complex question, it might be that certainly there's time critical. So again, you have to find within the amount of time. And now what I always say is, make sure that you also express how much time do we actually have to come to the answer, because that will also help the others in your team to focus. And then you can actually say, so if we have 30 minutes to come up with an answer, so how are we going to spend those 30 minutes? Then let's use, and I would debate, use 20 minutes to really understand what is the issue. Whereas what I see, most of the people are trying to use most of the time to find the answer. And I would say spend most of the time first to understand the issue, what's underneath. Because if you really understand what's underneath, if you follow the SCQH formula, the S, the C, and the Q, then spend the last 10 minutes, for instance, to come up with the answer. So spend more time, make sure everyone knows how much, and spend more time in analyzing, understanding the issue first.
And the sad thing is we're running short of time, and there are some great questions still to be addressed. So I would encourage everyone to come over to the hub, www.institutelm.com. Top right-hand tab is the hub. Sign in and let's continue this discussion, because I will do my best to just translate some of those key questions. And that only leaves me to say a huge thank you, Marco, for supporting this International Leadership Week right on the final day, and to give us such clear insight into, you know, sort of, if you like, the models that we can adapt in order to help us work through these complex and complicated issues. Please do join us, as I say, over at the Hub. Also take a look at the website to book onto the very last session of International Leadership Week, where we'll be having a roundup, really looking at the highlights across this tremendous week of insightful reinventing leadership. Thank you very much again. Thank you to you, Marco. Thank you to our audience. And yeah, we'll see you for the last session. Take care.